everyone! The goal of this video is to get you comfortable navigating Photoshop. If you've never used software like Photoshop before, it can be a little bit easy to feel overwhelmed by all of the icons, unfamiliar items, and menu sets. It might be surprising to know that Photoshop is actually pretty intuitive once you learn how to compartmentalize all of the components of its interface. We'll begin by walking through the specialized Photoshop menu sets and then move into using specific tools. By the end of the tutorial, you'll not only complete an advanced piece of art using photo manipulation, but you'll know how to solve creative problems through digital imaging. To get into this project, all you need is a copy of Photoshop and a selfie. If you don't feel like looking at your own mug for an hour, you can use a photo of somebody else as long as they're looking straight at the camera and they've given you explicit permission to use their picture. Personally, I think choosing a glam shot is self-care. Let's begin. This is the fancy new landing screen you'll see when you first open Adobe Photoshop. To the left, you have the options to create a new project or open a photo to edit. And down here, you have all of the recent projects you've been working on. I'm going to select my selfie from the bottom menu here to begin. You'll usually see this grid laying over the top of the image you're trying to edit when you first pull it into Photoshop. This is really useful for a lot of things that you could probably imagine you would use a grid for, but we're not going to be using it for this tutorial, so we're going to go ahead and turn it off. There are two ways to do this: by pressing Command or Control H on the keyboard, or by going up to the View menu and unchecking the Extras box. The keystroke option of Command or Control H that I just described is a hotkey. In order to work efficiently in almost any program, you'll benefit from memorizing that software's hotkeys. I'll continue to call out the hotkey option for each task we explore throughout this tutorial, and you can also find the hotkey for any task by hovering over a tool or looking to the right of any menu option. Or just a basic adjustment, I'll start in the Adjustments menu, usually beginning with Brightness and Contrast. Again, most of these are pretty self-explanatory, and you can push the brightness and contrast to either extreme to create a really intense kind of a zine look if you want to. And, contrast increases the difference between the darks and lights. Brightness is how light or dark it is. Curves. This is one I mess with a lot. Um, this one's a little bit harder to understand. It's essentially messing with the brightness, contrast, hue, saturation, vibrance, and all of that all at once. It's really fun to just kind of go in there and mess with it and see what happens as you bend the curves in different places. Again, you have some stylized or more extreme effects that you can get by doing this. And you have this channel box again with the colors, and you can adjust within those different parameter sets as well. A lot of these tools are pretty redundant, so I'll show you the ones I use. Hue and saturation is one I mess with almost every time. You can change the hue, which is like essentially the entire color set within a piece, by adjusting this parameter here. Saturation will increase or decrease the saturation, and light and dark will make it darker or lighter. Again, most of these will tell you essentially what they do. So color balance is a little bit different than hue and saturation, where hue and saturation will change all of the colors within the image. Color balance essentially puts like a whole color wash across the image. And there are different parts of color balance that you want to mess with here. Midtones is, the mid-range colors. This is when it's talking about the values of the piece. So the midtones are neither the dark nor the light, but right in the middle of dark and light. And so that will change the colors within that realm if you adjust with the midtone selected. Highlights changes the colors on the highlights of the piece, or the lighter values, and shadows is the darker values. Luminosity is a little bit of a trip. Luminosity, I'd consider essentially is like preserving those values or preserving the light and dark balance within the image. You can toggle that on and off and see what's going to look better for each piece. Typically, I want to preserve it so that I'm not altering it too severely. And again, that depends on the style or the look that you're going for in your final piece. The channel mixer. This is a blast. You can select the channels, again, synonyms with color in Photoshop speak, and you can get weird with this tool. Or you can be subtle, like usual. If you want to make something eerie and believably a different color, the channel mixer is your guy. You can just go pop art crazy in here. You can select different color channels. And again, as with most of these tools, like get in there, mess with it, change the different parameters. And one of the most beautiful things about digital art is the ability to save iterations and undo. So you can go pretty boldly through here. This is where I create most of my artistic effects in Photoshop, through this gallery.
I like having just this simple, clean interface with all the different options, and that preview of those options with the sailboats is so helpful. So you're not clicking on it and waiting for that 2 seconds to guess what it's going to look like. And oh, those 2 seconds add up because you have a finite amount of patience in digital art, especially when you're learning how to use it. So any way you can streamline your process is always good. So that's the super basics of the drop-down menus. Let's start looking at the tools now. First, you have this object select tool, and that's the first one we're going to use. This is great. Again, the menus pop up to tell you what they are. The object select tool is kind of new. What you do is drag a square around any object that you want to select within the image. And if there's a high contrast between the object and whatever's in the background of that object or in the, around that object, it will be selected really well. So for example, on the mouth here, it's going to lock right in and be really tight right away. However, we're going to be selecting the eye, and the eye is going to get a little bit of a fuzz around the outside, which is actually okay for our purposes because we are going to want to keep those pixels there. So to deselect an object, you click Command D, and to reselect an object, you click Command Shift D. Those are the hotkeys. So to select the eye, we're going to go to the Object Selection tool and drag it all around the eye, including the eyelid and all of the eyelashes, and keeping the box as close to the edges of the eyelashes and tear ducts and eyelid as possible. So you're going to see that this is a little bit of a rough selection. Again, we actually want to keep those pixels for the blending we're about to do. Now, if you hit Command C, you're going to copy this. You can also do this by going to Edit, Copy, and then if you click Command V, that's how you'll paste it, which can also be done through Edit Paste. So as long as you still have the object selected when you press Command V or when you paste the object will pop right back into the area that was selected by the lasso tool, which is, the original area where you selected it from. However, if you have deselected and pasted the object, it can appear almost anywhere on your canvas. So I like to try to paste something while I still have it selected just so that I can find it quickly. Now we're into the layers. So anytime you paste a new object, it will automatically appear in a new layer, which you can toggle on and off by clicking this eyeball here. So you can't see where the change happened because it is so perfectly overlaying the original object. And I'll show you when that's going to show up. First, let's lock the background layer. Locking layers is really important. This will keep you from having the mix up of accidentally painting on or adjusting a layer that you didn't intend to, which is a very easy mistake to make. So we're going to go ahead and rename the layer by double clicking inside the text box here. And I'm going to name this right eye because it's the right eye. This is also really important, tedious and annoying and hard to remember to do, but it's going to make a big difference in your workflow. Now we're selecting the lasso tool. Now, each of these tools has a submenu of other tools that will pop up if you right click on any tool. So if you see that little arrow in the corner, you can always right click and see what else it does. The reason we're selecting the lasso is because for some reason that's the easiest way to actually adjust the image. So with the lasso tool selected, we're going to right click inside of the object that we just pasted and go into free transform in order to move that object. And then you're going to see these handles come up that you can grab and then move the eye around with. If you have the arrow banking this bendy thing on the corner here, you can rotate it. You can change the different sizes by pulling these different boxes. Now, if you just pull it by grabbing any square, it will always change in proportion with itself. If you want to edit that in a more freeform way, hold the Shift key while you're making these adjustments. The next thing we're going to do is re-enter that free transform menu, and we want to flip the eye on the vertical axis, the up and down axis, because we're going to create four eyes on this piece that, one eye is under each other. We want to consider the contours of the skull or the face. We want to go for like any kind of realism in this photo modification. So I'm going to consider where the arc of my cheek is as I rotate and place this eye and try to lock it into those contours. Now we're just looking for placement right now. There are going to be other techniques we use to blend it after we've gone through some of the masking tools, which we're about to get into. Hit enter on your keyboard to leave this moving interface here. And the next thing we're going to do is try to blend it and soften the edges around this eye so that it doesn't look like it's something that's just cut out of a magazine and slapped on there. The way we're going to do this is by using the masking tool. So in order to mask a layer, we need to click on this little like white box with the black circle in it, this little icon down here. And the reason we want to mask instead of just erasing off the object is so that we have a little bit more flexibility as we're editing. Because with a mask, what you can do is you take a black brush, paint over that, and that will erase any of the information. So we're going to go to the brush here, and we want to make sure that we have a soft brush selected so that it creates a more organic or feathered edge by going up to this dialog box here. And you can select your different brushes through this menu. There are a lot of different brushes for different purposes. Another pretty intuitive interface in Photoshop. So the brush options are also pretty straightforward, but it's good to know what they are. So of course, up here you have your brush shape. Here you have your opacity, flow, smoothing. Smoothing is a little bit weird. Smoothing is the computer trying to guess where you would have wanted to make your strokes if you had a more steady hand. I don't feel like this interface actually works very well. I almost never use it myself, but some people like it a lot. So you can go ahead and try that if you feel like you're too shaky. Your opacity is the transparency of your brush, and the flow is almost as much ink is falling out of the brush. So maybe something like if you had less ink coming from an airbrush, the flow would go down. So you see we have the opacity a little lower here, and we have the brush on black so that we can cover the image. Now if you select the eraser, then you're erasing the black ink from the masking layer, thus revealing the image. So everywhere that you paint black is where the image disappears. We want to go through and softly start to take away the edges of the eye to help it blend. If you're working with just a mouse, I would do this by clicking several times around the edges with a larger round brush. I personally feel like that helps give me a lot more control when I'm doing this. And once you're pretty happy with those edges is when we're going to get into more of the warp tools. But for now, it's going to be a little bit of a push and pull. So once you're done, getting a lot of that pixel information out, go back to the eraser and you can start erasing out any of the brush information that you don't want there anymore, or to like bring the image back. And this is where zooming in really close can become pretty important. On there's my overdrawn lips. I zoomed in really close to those. That's okay. In the internet, we have no secrets. So I'm just going to go in and carefully start cleaning up these edges. Again, it's going to be a little bit of a back and forth through here. And you want to consider like transparent eyelashes aren't very realistic the way they're fading here. And so it's going to take a minute to really dial this in using just a mouse. And go ahead and take your time here because having these clean edges is going to be really important. Now, the nice thing about the mask is that once you have the mask on, as you edit the original object, the mask will actually go with it. So we don't want to keep the top eyelid information the way that it is where it's at, because I don't think it's actually going to create that much realism because that skin doesn't match the skin on the cheek. And we will get more into that in just a minute. So there are other ways to help blend any pasted objects into your image, and sometimes you're going to be pasting objects from other images, so this can become really important here. So we're going to revisit the menus that we went over in the beginning of the tutorial, in like the image and filter menus. So we're going to go to image, brightness, and contrast first. And the reason I'm going into brightness and contrast is because we want to consider the values of the underlying image. So in this case, my eyes are actually set deeper into my eye socket, so they're a little bit more in shadow. And then once you have them in the context of the highlight of the cheek, it looks darker once it's there. So we want it to look like the light is interacting with every piece that is being added to the photo if we want to go for any kind of realism, surrealism. So I'm going to start turning the brightness up and also increasing the contrast and just adjusting these parameters until it looks a little bit more like it's fitting into the environment that it's on. You can also do this through curves, color balance, hue, and saturation. Again, this is especially true if you're pulling a piece of an image from another image. Since we're pulling this from the original image that it came from, a lot of the channels don't actually have to be adjusted quite as much. All right, now that we have the colors and the values balanced pretty well, I want to get into one of my favorite tools, which is the warp tool. So by right clicking with the lasso tool and going into free transform, you can select the option warp. This is crazy. So as you can see, when you pull these corners in different areas, it'll start to warp the image underneath. And so I'm going to try to bend the eye to match the contours of the cheek here. And this can take a mess with. You can grab anywhere inside of this box as well in order to warp it. I mostly work with the different anchor points that exist around the parameters of the warp tool. So you have these little dots that are like handles that pull it different ways, and then the corners themselves that pull it different ways. And so as you start messing with this, it is pretty intuitive, and you kind of get a sense of where you want it to go and how to get it to blend. And this is another stage that you want to take your time with a little bit until it really feels right. Contours of the skull or the bends of the skin in mind as you do this. Once you're happy with how the eye looks, it's time to duplicate the eye to the other side of the face. To do this, we're going to right-click on the right eye layer and select Duplicate Layer. Rename the layer to Left Eye. Select your lasso again and right-click on the eye to enter Free Transform. Flip the eye on the horizontal axis and place it on the other cheek. We saved a lot of time by duplicating the eye after it had been masked and warped because the mask is duplicated as well. It will only take minor adjustments and rotations to get the left eye to fit in with the face. Let's use some of those tools and filters we went over in the beginning to alter the iris. To do that, first we're going to use the Object Select tool again to select the iris. A great feature that exists in any of the selection tools is Feather. When you right-click after selecting your object, select Feather Selection. This softens the edge of your selection, which helps reduce that cut and pasted look. You'll have to get used to messing with the parameters in this dialog box since it doesn't offer a preview of your feathering. For the iris, a 5-pixel radius should work just fine. Now that we have the iris selected, we're going to go to the Image drop-down menu and adjust the color balance. Select Image, Adjustments, Color Balance. This is fun to explore. See what happens when you alter different colors, values, and toggle off and on Preserve Luminosity. When you change an eye color to something really unnatural like this, it can look off. One reason this is happening is because color balance creates a color wash, which also covers the black and white values. You can pull the values back to a more realistic level of contrast using the dodge and burn tools. I'm going to use the burn tool first to darken the iris. These tools work a lot like the brush tool. You can adjust the exposure the same way you would adjust opacity, and like the color balance interface, you can choose between midtones, highlights, and shadows. I'm just going to click several times on the iris until I'm happy with the levels. Now I'm going to do essentially the same thing with the dodge tool. The dodge tool is the opposite of the burn tool in a way, so it lightens the area. The dodge tool can be found in the same submenu as the burn tool as well. I'm going to carefully use the dodge tool to pull the white and the highlights back into the eye. In addition to pulling the black and white back into an object using the dodge and burn tools, you can use these to shade an object to better match what it's trying to blend into. So I'm going to use the dodge tool first to make the eyeball look more realistic or like it's in that lighting environment. A good way to judge this is to toggle the layer on and off like this to see what the values underneath the pasted object look like. Changing the opacity using this knob is another great way to do that. All of these tools will be really useful. Never forget that you can change the visibility of something. It's so important. So I'm going to keep in mind that the eyeball is a round object. And so I want to keep that round shading in mind as I pull the highlights back around it and keep it on kind of a curve as it goes around the contour of the eyeball. Then I'm going to be doing the same thing with the burn tool in order to create the shadows, keeping the curve in mind and hitting the bottom parts of the eye where the light source is not hitting it. Another thing I want to do with the burn tool is create a shadow underneath the hair where that would be casting a shadow on the eyeball. This can also be done using a low opacity brush tool or a multiply blend mode. That's an entire other interface that we can get into in a different tutorial. For now, these tools are really simple to use and a great way to start adding realism to any kind of photo manipulation like this. I'm going to use the sponge tool really quick to just desaturate the iris slightly, and especially in where the shadows are hitting, and that will help add a little bit of realism as well. The last thing we're going to want to do is figure out a way to make these look more like they would actually be eyeballs on the cheeks. And so the way to do that would be to create like some kind of wrinkles or eyelids, some kind of fold or way to imply that the skin has been affected by that object. There are several different ways that this could be done, but I think this is a great time to introduce you to the clone stamp tool, which is good for so many things. So we're going to zoom in really close in order to do this. And what the clone stamp does is it selects pixels from a specific area And then it creates a brush essentially out of those pixels, and it will paint them back onto the new area that you're working on. So this can be a little bit scary to mess with because you can't use the clone stamp on an area that doesn't have those pixels. So we're going to have to go to our base layer in order to do that. If you're worried about affecting your base layer in a way that is hard to take back, you can duplicate your base layer and have a version that is still the original underneath it, and then start using the clone tool on top of that. The first thing you need to do when you're in the clone tool is select the pixels that you're going to be pulling over to the eye. So I'm going to start with the shadows. So I'm going to pick a dark area of skin that's closest to the area I'm working in so that I'll pull those dark pixels in to create that crease. And this can be a pretty painstaking process if you really want it to look good. And so I'll continually select different dark pixels, and sometimes what you think is going to work doesn't actually work, and you have to experiment with different chunks of the image in order to find the exact right pieces that are going to work for that clone tool. And so this is another push and pull process. And then the same process is going to happen as I pull from the light parts of the skin to create the lighter pieces of the folds in the skin around the eye. And when you're done with this, you're done with your piece.
Well, that concludes this tutorial. I hope this video helped you gain confidence and familiarity with Adobe Photoshop. There are countless Photoshop tutorials online that can help deepen your understanding from here. The most important thing to remember as you embark in your journey into digital art is edit, undo. Huck it, you've got nothing to lose but ephemeral pixels anyway.